Page 6 is reporting that Meghan Markle felt humiliated on Prince Harry's most recent UK trip and that the trip turned into a nightmare, forcing Markle and her children to return home to California earlier than they had hoped.
Breaking today, Meghan Markle's fashion freeze-out. She has been dumped by Balenciaga just 1 year after she thought, I'm going to invite myself appearance at Paris Fashion Week was going to change her career for good.
And her husband lost big in court. No one wants to be seen on the arm of a loser. I think that this trip was a reality check. Harry has spent years insisting he can be half in and half out of the monarchy.
Remember, 47 minutes is not a reconciliation. It's not a get-together, we're so thrilled to see you.
Noticeably, one person was not at the show. His supposed good friend and collaborator, according to her, the Duchess of Sussex. And this is where it gets juicy. Paula's source revealed. Oh God, no! She was not invited. Not after what happened last time.
Another point to make is Harry and Meghan were kept waiting, encircling Highgrove for some considerable length of time, not even sure that the meeting was going to take.
The request did not arrive through official channels, and it carried none of the careful language normally used for royal communication. Meghan wanted to speak directly to King Charles, alone and without palace advisors, but the private reason behind her demand threatened to reopen wounds the monarchy had struggled to bury. It reached a senior member of Charles's household after normal working hours, when the palace machinery had slowed and only a small circle remained alert to anything urgent. There was no formal letterhead, no carefully approved statement, and no clear sign that the usual royal channels had been consulted. That alone caused alarm. Meghan had not approached the institution. She had tried to reach the man behind the crown. Her request was precise. She was not asking for a family reunion, a public show of reconciliation, or a place at some future ceremony. She wanted a private, face-to-face meeting with Charles. No William, no courtiers, no lawyers, no communications advisors. Nothing that could turn the conversation into an official negotiation. According to the message, Meghan believed Charles was the only senior royal who might still hear her without immediately viewing every word as a challenge to the monarchy. She appeared to be appealing to his sympathy as a father and grandfather, not his authority as king. Yet that emotional approach only made the request more dangerous. Harry supported the idea, but not without fear. He knew a private conversation could become the last real chance to repair the damage between them. He also knew one wrong accusation, one misunderstood promise, or one angry exchange could destroy what little remained of his bond with Charles. He wanted his father to listen, but he feared what might happen once the door closed. Meghan refused to explain the full subject in writing. She insisted it was too sensitive for an email, a letter, or any official palace record. Only fragments appeared: future, security, children, legacy, and private assurances. Those words changed the mood immediately. This was no longer simply about hurt feelings. It seemed to involve the Sussexes' place in the royal family and promises Meghan believed had never been honored. The palace faced a brutal dilemma. Ignore her, and Harry and Meghan could say they had been denied a final opportunity for peace. Accept her terms, and Meghan would gain private access to the king without witnesses, records, or protection against conflicting accounts. Before Charles could decide, the message was quietly forwarded to William. Meghan had specifically demanded that he remain outside the conversation. But by then, her appeal had already reached the one man most determined to prevent the monarchy from being placed in that position again. And when William finally read the exact conditions Meghan had attached to the meeting, he did not see an appeal for peace. He saw the opening move in a far more dangerous palace battle. Charles saw a son's troubled marriage, 2 distant grandchildren, and one final chance to prevent permanent separation. William saw something entirely different: an undocumented conversation, an emotionally vulnerable king, and a carefully designed situation that could later be presented to the world in whatever form Meghan chose. That difference shaped everything that followed. Charles reacted first as a father. The request stirred guilt he had spent years trying to control, the fear that rejecting Meghan would confirm Harry's darkest belief that his family no longer cared whether he returned. Charles understood the danger, but he also feared becoming the man who allowed palace rules to crush the last possibility of reconciliation. William's instincts moved in the opposite direction. To him, the absence of witnesses was not a gesture of trust. It was the greatest warning of all. Private family conversations had already escaped into interviews, memoirs, documentaries, and reports attributed to unnamed sources. Each time, the palace faced the same impossible choice: remain silent and allow one version to stand, or respond and expose even more of the family's private pain. Why, William asked, could Meghan not provide even a basic agenda? She did not need to reveal every detail. A few clear subjects would have allowed Charles to prepare. Instead, she was asking the king to enter a deeply emotional conversation without knowing what claims, demands, or memories might be placed before him. William did not see sensitivity in that silence. He saw strategy. His role around Charles had changed. As the king carried the burden of the crown, William had become increasingly protective of the decisions made around him. He no longer believed private family pressure could be separated from constitutional consequence. One sympathetic sentence from Charles could be remembered as a promise. One emotional assurance could later be treated as approval. That growing protectiveness created a quiet rivalry between father and son. Charles believed William's resistance had become too rigid, perhaps even personal. William believed Charles' compassion repeatedly left him open to emotional pressure. Meghan's decision to bypass William only deepened that suspicion. From his perspective, she was testing whether she could divide the king from his heir and force Charles to prove that William did not control access to him. Then, Harry contacted his father separately. His message was not aggressive. It was wounded, restrained, and painfully simple. He described the meeting as a request for dignity, privacy, and one honest chance to be heard. That tone reached Charles in a way Meghan's formal conditions had not, and his hesitation grew. William still did not refuse outright. Instead, he asked palace officials to uncover what Meghan wanted and why the request had arrived now. The answer changed the entire calculation. The timing appeared to overlap with confidential discussions involving titles, royal access, inheritance, security, and the future public position of Harry and Meghan's children. The request was no longer being treated as a family conversation, because buried beneath Meghan's appeal was a question the palace had avoided for years, and answering it privately could reshape the Sussexes' royal future. For days, the palace tried to discover what Meghan intended to say behind closed doors. Then a fragment of the truth emerged through an unofficial contact, and suddenly her demand for privacy made sense. Because the conversation appeared to involve promises, privileges, and a royal future no one had formally approved. The meeting, it seemed, was meant to address the long-term position of Meghan's family inside the monarchy. Not merely invitations or public appearances, but the recognition of Archie and Lilibet, their future access to royal occasions, questions of personal security, and the kind of relationship they would be permitted to have with Charles. These were not small requests. They touched the future shape of the family itself. Meghan allegedly wanted verbal assurances from the king before palace committees. Constitutional advisors or senior royals could narrow his response. She believed that once the matter entered official channels, compassion would be replaced by caution, and every possible offer would be reduced to its safest form. At the heart of her argument was an even more dangerous claim that private understandings had already existed during the final period before she and Harry stepped away from royal duties. Harry supported that belief. He remembered conversations that suggested certain doors might remain open, even though nothing had been formally recorded. Now memory and documentation stood against each other, and neither side could retreat without accusing the other of rewriting the past. Charles was especially vulnerable where the children were concerned. Meghan understood that Archie and Lilibet were not only grandchildren he rarely saw, they were part of the royal story, whether the palace felt comfortable admitting it or not. A simple expression of affection from Charles could carry enormous emotional weight. That was precisely what William feared. A compassionate remark could later be presented as a royal promise. A father's reassurance might be interpreted as a decision by the king. Meghan also wanted clarity about her own future access. Could she attend significant royal occasions independently, or would every appearance be controlled through William's household? Would she always be treated only as Harry's controversial wife, rather than as the mother of the king's grandchildren? Then came the inheritance question. Not simply money, but personal letters, photographs, Diana-linked objects, and family possessions whose emotional value far exceeded their price. That possibility divided the palace. Some believed one private conversation could finally reduce years of hostility. Others believed Meghan was seeking promises that could not survive formal examination. Charles considered a compromise, a short meeting, one trusted private secretary, no recording devices, and a written summary afterward. Meghan rejected it immediately. Any third person, she argued, would destroy the honesty she was asking for. To William, that refusal confirmed everything. Transparency was not protecting the conversation. It was the one condition Meghan would not accept. Yet Charles remained tempted, forcing William toward a choice he had hoped to avoid. William had warned, questioned, and delayed. But Charles had not closed the door, and that meant the Prince of Wales was approaching a decision that could permanently alter his relationship with both his father and his brother. The decision came during a private palace discussion that was never meant to leave the room. Charles asked whether a tightly controlled meeting could still happen. William's answer was immediate, uncompromising, and devastating. Meghan would not be granted private access to the king under those conditions. William did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His refusal carried the force of someone who had already measured every possible consequence. Meghan would not be allowed an unrecorded, one-to-one conversation with Charles. Any future contact would require safeguards, witnesses, and a clear account of what had been discussed. He was not issuing an order to the sovereign. Charles remained king, and William knew the boundary he was approaching. But he made his own position unmistakable. He would not arrange the meeting, support it, or defend the damage if private words later became disputed promises. The conditions were firm. Meghan would need to provide a written agenda. A senior palace representative would remain present. No secret assurances could be offered, and every conclusion would be documented. To William, these were not acts of hostility. They were the minimum protections required when personal pain had become inseparable from royal consequence. Charles felt cornered. As king, he resented the suggestion that he could not judge the situation himself. As a father, he understood why William no longer trusted conversations without witnesses. Still, one question cut through the formal language. Was William protecting the crown or punishing Harry? William's answer was cold because he believed it had to be. The issue, he insisted, was no longer personal. A private remark from the monarch could become a financial demand, a constitutional argument, or a public accusation once removed from the room in which it was spoken. Harry did not hear the refusal from Charles. It reached him indirectly through a channel stripped of warmth and explanation. That detail deepened the injury. To Harry, William was no longer advising their father. He was controlling who could reach him. Meghan's reaction was restrained at first. She had expected caution, perhaps delay, but not William's intervention before Charles had answered her personally. Then restraint turned into suspicion. She began to see the refusal as proof that William feared what she might reveal, something capable of changing Charles's understanding of the past. Harry called a palace aide in anger. He accused William of becoming a gatekeeper, replacing family relationships with institutional permission. Yet Charles said nothing. He neither defended William openly nor reversed the decision privately, and his silence wounded both sons in different ways. The meeting had been stopped, but the conflict had not. Meghan now considered another route. If she could not speak directly, she would place her claims before Charles in a form no private secretary could interrupt. Soon afterward, a written package prepared for the king alone began moving toward the palace. Inside were allegations that could force Charles to question not only William, but the advisors he had trusted for years. William had successfully blocked the room, the secrecy, and the private promise Meghan wanted, but he could not block the document now moving toward Charles, or the revelation hidden inside it. When the sealed material finally reached the king's household, the true purpose of Meghan's request emerged. She had not simply wanted sympathy or an invitation back into royal life. She wanted Charles to acknowledge an alleged private understanding that could challenge William's control over the monarchy's next chapter. According to Meghan's account, earlier private discussions had left open the possibility of a future role for Harry, Meghan, and their children, one that looked very different from the arrangement established when they stepped away. It was not a formal promise that they would return as working royals. Nothing had been signed. No official position had been created. Yet Meghan believed Charles had suggested that family access, ceremonial inclusion, security, and direct contact could be reconsidered when tensions had cooled. William rejected that interpretation completely. To him, emotional reassurance offered during a family crisis could not be turned into permanent royal entitlement. A father trying to comfort his son was not the same as a king approving future privileges. But Meghan's written claims went further. She argued that Charles's position had hardened only after palace officials and senior advisors became involved. Private conversations, she believed, had created one set of expectations, while the institution later imposed another. That was why she had wanted Charles alone. She feared advisors would interrupt, reduce his answers to safe language, or prevent him from acknowledging what he had once appeared willing to consider. Then came the most emotionally charged argument of all. Archie and Lilibet, Meghan insisted, should not inherit the punishment created by decisions made during their parents' departure. Their connection to the king, their presence at future ceremonies, and their place within the wider family should not depend on an unresolved conflict they had played no part in creating. As Charles read, fragments of the past returned with uncomfortable force. Some conversations felt familiar. Some phrases sounded possible. But the meanings now attached to them seemed far broader than he had ever intended. Diana's shadow also entered the dispute. Harry believed both her sons had once been promised protection from the cold machinery of royal life. Now, in his eyes, William was using that same machinery to block him. The package referred to private family property. Diana linked possessions, accommodation in Britain, future ceremonies, security, and direct communication with Charles. Every page increased the pressure. If Charles admitted that any informal understanding had existed, William's refusal could appear to be an heir overruling his father. If Charles denied it, Harry might see that denial as the final betrayal. Meghan believed the private meeting had been her last chance to explain everything without public performance. William believed privacy was exactly how pressure would be applied. Charles summoned William again. This time, Meghan's allegations would be on the table, and protocol alone would not protect either man. The first confrontation had been about whether Meghan would enter the room, But the second would be about something far more dangerous, whether William had protected Charles from manipulation or prevented him from facing an uncomfortable truth. Behind palace doors, Charles placed Meghan's claims before William and asked the question neither man wanted spoken aloud. Had the Prince of Wales blocked the meeting because it endangered the monarchy, or because he could no longer separate his duty from his anger toward Harry and Meghan? The confrontation was no longer about one request. It was about trust, authority, and the future balance of power inside the monarchy. Charles reminded William that he was still the king, and Harry was still his son. He could not accept a system in which every difficult family appeal required the approval of the heir before it reached him. William did not retreat. He insisted that he had never denied Charles the right to communicate. What he opposed was a secret meeting designed to exclude witnesses, records, and every protection the palace had learned it needed. To him, the danger was not the conversation itself, it was what that conversation could become afterward. Charles's frustration deepened. He believed William increasingly treated every emotional decision as a threat to the crown. William believed his father still underestimated how quickly kindness could become leverage once private words entered the public arena. Years of buried resentment finally surfaced. William had remained inside the institution, accepted its limits, and carried responsibilities that narrowed his private life. Harry had left, criticized the system from a distance, and yet still expected direct royal access, security, recognition, and influence. William could not ignore that contradiction. But Charles warned him that Harry's exile could become permanent. Refusing every route back might create the very separation they once claimed they wanted to prevent. Meghan was not in the room, yet her influence dominated it. Her request had exposed a division palace advisors had worked hard to hide. Charles believed in flexibility, while William believed survival depended on firm boundaries. Charles considered writing to Meghan directly. He would answer limited questions, reject the private meeting, and attempt to lower the temperature. William warned that every sentence would have to be exact. One compassionate phrase could later be described as confirmation of Meghan's claims. A senior advisor quietly recognized the deeper danger. This was beginning to resemble a succession struggle in miniature, the current king defending his freedom to act, and the future king trying to prevent choices he might one day inherit. Charles finally made a partial concession. Meghan would not receive the private meeting she demanded, but William would not be allowed to control every future channel between the king and the Sussexes. William accepted the decision, though the cost was clear. Meghan had created distance between father and heir without ever entering the palace. Then Harry received a message from Charles's office. For one brief moment, he believed his father had overruled William. That hope lasted only until he read the conditions. Charles had reopened the possibility of contact, but the terms he imposed would force Harry and Meghan to choose between the privacy they demanded and the royal acknowledgement they desperately wanted. The king's response offered no private meeting, no secret promise, and no victory over William. Instead, it presented Harry with a brutal choice: accept a formal conversation under palace rules, or support Meghan's refusal and risk losing the final direct path back to his father. Charles's offer was narrow but unmistakable. A meeting could take place, yet Harry would have to attend. Two neutral officials would remain present. Every subject would be agreed in advance, and no informal commitments would be made. Nothing would be left to memory alone. The palace had opened a door, but only after placing guards around every word spoken inside it. To Meghan, the conditions proved that William had prevailed. What she had requested as an honest conversation had been transformed into a controlled negotiation. She would not be speaking to Charles as a daughter-in-law or the mother of his grandchildren. She would be entering a formal process shaped by suspicion. Harry felt the pressure immediately. Defending Meghan meant rejecting terms she considered humiliating. But refusing the offer could close the last direct route to his father for months, perhaps years. He had spent so long demanding to be heard that walking away now felt almost impossible. Meghan argued that accepting would legitimize William's authority over their family relationship. It would make her appear to have surrendered before the conversation began. Harry then asked the question neither of them could avoid. Were they seeking reconciliation or recognition? One required compromise. The other demanded clear guarantees involving status, access, security, and the children's future. That distinction reopened Harry's oldest pain. He feared returning to another palace conversation where officials recorded every sentence while he tried to explain grief that had never fitted neatly into royal language. To him, witnesses did not create safety. They created distance. William, however, insisted Harry's presence was essential. Meghan could not privately negotiate matters affecting Harry's royal identity, his family history, or his relationship with the crown. Meghan interpreted that condition differently. She feared Harry would be placed between her account and Charles's, forced to choose whom to believe while advisors watched. Outside the palace, whispers of attempted contact began circulating. Charles did not want the dispute described as his rejection of Meghan, but he would not contradict William's concerns merely to improve appearances. Harry came close to accepting. Then Meghan raised one final condition. Would Charles directly answer whether the earlier private understanding had existed? The palace refused to guarantee a response. The claim remained disputed, and Charles would not be pressured into confirming or denying it in advance. Harry delayed his answer. Inside the palace, William prepared for the possibility that silence meant refusal, and that refusal might soon be followed by a public version of events. The palace had created a controlled path forward, but every hour of silence made that path narrower, and beyond it waited the possibility of a public revelation neither Charles nor William could contain. No car entered the palace gates. No private room was prepared. Meghan never sat across from Charles, and William's boundary remained intact. Yet the meeting's failure produced consequences more damaging than the conversation itself, leaving every royal relationship altered by what had almost been said. Meghan ultimately refused the formal arrangement. The presence of officials, the agreed agenda, and the promise that every outcome would be documented stripped the conversation of the privacy she had demanded from the beginning. To her, it was no longer a chance to speak honestly to Charles. It had become a controlled palace procedure built around distrust. Harry supported her decision publicly. Privately, the outcome was harder to accept. A rare opening from his father had appeared, and now it had closed before either side had fully heard the other. He could defend Meghan's refusal, or regret the lost opportunity, but doing both left him trapped between loyalty and grief. William's victory was equally complicated. He had stopped an undocumented meeting and protected the palace from the immediate danger of disputed promises. Yet his intervention strengthened Harry's belief that reconciliation was impossible, while William controlled the conditions surrounding Charles. Charles carried the deepest regret. He believed the safeguards were necessary, but the question remained. Could one honest conversation have prevented years of bitterness? Or would it simply have created another wound, remembered differently by everyone involved? The failed meeting changed palace policy. From that point forward, all significant communication with Harry and Meghan would be written, witnessed, or handled through formal representatives. Nothing sensitive would depend on memory alone. That decision reached beyond the adults. Archie and Lilibet's connection to the royal family now became entangled in arguments about security, access, trust, status, and promises they had never heard. Their future relationship with Charles would carry the weight of a conflict created before they could understand it. Meghan believed she had offered the king a final chance to hear her truth directly, only for William to close the door before Charles could decide freely. William saw the opposite. To him, the episode proved that emotional appeals could conceal institutional demands and that the Crown could never make lasting decisions under private pressure. Harry remained caught between those two versions. Defending one appeared to betray the other. The sealed package left its own mystery. Some claims were privately answered. Others were rejected. At least one remained unresolved, because only Charles and Harry knew what had truly been said years earlier. In the end, the conflict had never been only about a meeting. It was about access to the monarch, ownership of the royal narrative, competing memories, and the transfer of power slowly moving from Charles to William. Meghan had lost the room she wanted, but William's refusal had handed her a different story, one in which the future king decided who could speak and who remained outside. And as the palace doors remained closed, one unanswered question continued to haunt the monarchy. Had William prevented a carefully constructed trap? Or had he silenced the last conversation capable of saving his family?